Autonomous Self-Organization and Anarchist Intervention, Attention and Practice by Wolfi Landstreicher. Introduction, a few definitions and explanations. Any potentially liberatory struggle among the exploited and dispossessed must be based on autonomous self-organization. As anarchists, who are usually among the exploited, we have every reason to participate in and encourage these struggles. But since we have specific ideas of how we want to go about our struggles and a specifically revolutionary aim, our participation takes the form of an intervention seeking to move the struggles in a specific direction. Having no desire to be any sort of vanguard or leadership, or to be caught up in the joyless game of politicking, we find ourselves in a tension of trying to live our conception of struggle and freedom within the context of an unfree reality, of trying to confront the real daily problems we face with our own refusal to play by the rules of this world. Thus, the question of autonomous self-organization and anarchist intervention is an ongoing problem with which to grapple, refusing to fall into easy answers and faith in organizational panaceas. To begin exploring this question, let's start with a few definitions and explanations. Autonomous self-organization. When I speak of autonomous self-organization, I'm speaking of a specific phenomenon that tends to arise whenever people, angered by their conditions and having lost faith in the delegated to act for them, angered by their conditions and having lost faith in those delegated to act for them, decided to act for themselves. Autonomous self-organization, therefore, never manifests in the form of a political party, a union, or any other sort of representative organization. All of these forms of organization claim to represent the people in struggle, to act in their name. And what defines autonomous self-organization is precisely the rejection of all representation. Parties, unions, and other representative organizations tend to interact with autonomous organization only in the form of recuperators of the struggle, striving to take over leadership and impose themselves as spokespeople of the struggle, usually with the aim of negotiating with the rulers. Thus, they can only be viewed as potential usurpers wherever real self-organized revolt is occurring. Autonomous self-organization has certain essential traits that define it. First of all, it's non-hierarchical. There is no institutional or permanent leadership or authority. While someone who proves particularly knowledgeable with regards to specific matters relating to the struggle at hand will be given the attention she deserves for such knowledge. This cannot be allowed to become the basis for any permanent leadership role, because that would undermine another essential trait of autonomous self-organization: horizontal communication and relationships. This is a matter of people talking with each other, interacting with each other, expressing needs and desires openly, actually discussing the problems they face together and in practical terms, without any leadership to conform this expression to set a line. This brings us to another trait, one that may be controversial to collectivist ideologues, but that is the only way of guaranteeing the first two traits. The basic unit of autonomous self-organization is the individual. Otherwise, it could be argued that all states and businesses are autonomous self-organization, because on the institutional and collective level, they do organize themselves. But the individuals who compromise their human component are defined by these institutions and placed in accordance with the institutional needs. So autonomous self-organization is, first of all, the individual organizing his struggle against the conditions this world forces upon her on her terms, on her own terms, finding the means necessary for carrying out that struggle. But among the means necessary are relations with other people. So autonomous self-organization is also a collective practice. But that collective practice is not based upon conforming individuals to an organization imposed on them, but rather on the development of relationships of mutuality between them, in which they discover the areas of commonality in their struggles and need, affinity in their dreams and desires. One could say that autonomous self-organization is a development of a shared struggle based on mutuality for the full realization of each individual involved. To further clarify this point, and to quickly counter a false dichotomy often made in revolutionary milieus, one can look at it in terms of revolutionary class struggle. While the details vary, anti-state, anti-capitalist revolutionaries generally agree that the revolutionary task of the exploited class is to abolish itself as a class as it abolishes class society. What does this mean, and when does it happen in the course of struggle? It seems to me that this means precisely the rediscovery of oneself as an individual with one's own desires, needs, and dreams, which have no relation to what capital has to offer. Desires, needs, and dreams best fulfilled in free association with others based on mutuality and affinity. When in the course of struggle, the exploited begin to find the methods of organizing their own activity together, this process of abolishing themselves as a class has already begun, since they are beginning precisely to talk and act with each other as individuals. Finally, autonomous self-organization is practical. It is not the setting up of any formal organization to represent anything. It is rather the bringing together of the elements necessary for accomplishing the various tasks and activities necessary to the particular struggle. This will tend to include the development of ways to communicate, ways to coordinate action, ways to gather necessary tools, and so on. As will be seen below, in large-scale struggles, assemblies tend to develop for discussing what is necessary. These are not formalized structures, but rather specific methods for dealing with the problems at hand. Anarchist intervention. We anarchists are ourselves among the exploited and dispossessed. Thus, we have an immediate need to struggle against this social order. At the same time, we come to these daily struggles with a conscious revolutionary perspective and with specific ideas about how to go about these struggles. Thus, it is inevitable that our participation as anarchists will take the form of intervention. So it is worthwhile to consider what makes our participation an intervention. First of all, as anarchists, we come to every struggle with a conscious revolutionary perspective. Whatever the specific cause that provokes a struggle, we recognize it as an aspect of a social order that must be destroyed in order to open the possibilities for a free and self-determined existence. Struggles and revolts are generally provoked by specific circumstances, not by mass recognition of the need to destroy the state, capital, and all the institutions through which domination and exploitation are carried out. Anarchist intervention, therefore, attempts to expand the struggle beyond the circumscribed cause that provokes it, to point out, not just in words, but through action, the connection of the specific problem at hand to the larger reality of the social order that surrounds us. This would include finding and exposing the commonalities between various struggles, as well as the differences that can enhance a broader struggle of revolt. Because we anarchists come to any struggle with a specific revolutionary perspective, it is in our interest to propose a methodology of struggle which carries this perspective in it. A principled methodology which provides a basis for our complicity in any struggle. The methodology of which I speak is not just a methodology for struggle, but something to apply to all of life as far as possible. First of all, the struggle must be carried out with the complete autonomy from all representative organizations. We need to recognize unions and parties as usurpers and determine our specific activities in any struggle for ourselves without regard for their demands. Secondly, our practice needs to be that of true direct action, figuring out how to accomplish the specific task we pose on our own, not demanding any authority or any representative of the struggle to act for us. Thirdly, we need to remain in permanent conflict with the social order we oppose with regard to specific matter at hand, keeping our attacks up in order to make it clear that we have no intention of being recuperated. Fourthly, we need to be on the attack, refusing to negotiate or compromise with those in power. This methodology carries with it the principle of self-organization and the revolutionary necessity to destroy the present ruling order. Because of the nature of our anarchist aspirations, our intervention and struggles will also express itself as a tension on several levels. First of all, as I said, most of us are ourselves among the exploited and dispossessed of the current social order, not part of the ruling or managing classes. Thus, we face the same immediate realities as those around us, with the same desire for immediate relief. We also have a desire for a new world and want to bring this desire into all of our struggles, not just in words, but in the way we go about our practice. Thus, there is the tension of willfully moving toward autonomy and freedom under oppressive conditions. In addition, we have specific ways in which we desire to go about our struggles and live our lives. These methods are based on horizontal relationships and refusal of hierarchy and vanguardism. So there is a tension of striving to find ways of putting forth our conceptions of how to go about struggle that encourage already existing tendencies towards self-organization and direct action that do not fall into the methods of political evangelism. We are, after all, seeking to relate as comrades and accomplices, not leaders. And then there is a tension of wanting to act immediately against the impositions of this society upon our lives, regardless of the current level of struggle, while again avoiding any tendency towards vanguardism. In a sense, anarchist intervention is a tightrope between living our own struggle in our daily lives and finding ways to connect this struggle with the struggles of all the exploited, most of whom do not share our conscious perspectives. A connection that is necessary if we are to move in the direction of social insurrection and revolution. A misstep in one direction turns our struggle in on itself, transforming it into an individual radical hedonism without any social relevance. A misstep in the other direction turns it into just another political party, whatever name one might give it to hide this fact, vying for control over social struggle. This is why we have to keep in mind that we are not seeking followers, adherents, but accomplices in the crime of freedom. Anarchist intervention can occur under two circumstances: where a self-organized struggle of exploited is in course, or where a specific situation calls for immediate response, and anarchists strive to encourage self-organized methods of responding. An example of the first situation would be a wildcat strike movement in course, in which anarchists could express solidarity, encourage the spread of the strike, expose betrayals by the union, share a broader critique of the union as an institution, and share visions of a different way of encountering life and the world than that of working to maintain a certain level of survival. We will look at a variety of other examples below. The second sort of intervention would be something such as the building of a nuclear missile base in the area where one lives, or police murder of the poor minority people. These call for an immediate response. And anarchists facing such situations will want to carry out and encourage autonomous responses using direct action rather than making demands to those in power. The precise way in which anarchists might intervene in such situations would vary depending on circumstances. But the point is always to encourage the tendency toward autonomy, self-organization, and direct action rather than to push a political perspective. Some historical and current situations. Fortunately, since those whose lives are stolen from them frequently reach a level of anger at their conditions and distrust for both the rulers and those who claim to represent the exploited, it is not difficult to find examples of the practice of autonomous self-organization. In some of these circumstances, we can also find some examples of intervention by anti-political, if not always specifically anarchist, revolutionaries in these struggles. In addition, I have found one example of an anarchist intervention in response to a specific situation where they acted to encourage self-organized direct action against the installation of a nuclear missile base in Sicily. Let's look at some of these instances. Italy, 1970s. During the 1970s, Italy experienced a massive social movement of revolt involving workers, students, and poor and exploited youth, with women playing a major role in much of the activity. One of the outstanding characteristics of this movement was precisely its autonomy from the usual organizations that claim to represent the struggle of the exploited. Neither unions nor parties led the movement, and suspicion of these organizations was high and became higher as blatant attempts by parties and unions to recuperate or discredit the struggles exposed their real nature. In the course of these struggles, a variety of different forms of wildcat strike, massive demonstrations, sabotage, massive occupations of housing and other spaces, street battles with cops and fascists, and a great number of other forms of direct action took place throughout the country. In addition, armed struggle began to develop in a variety of forms, often lacking the spectacular and specialized form of groups like the Red Brigades. In order to communicate the realities of this struggle with each other and to coordinate activity, spontaneous assemblies developed in factories, occupied universities, and neighborhoods. The often vehement discussions and debates raised questions of the nature of this society and how to fight against it to very high levels, including questions of work as such, and not just specific working conditions, of marriage, the family as sources of oppressive gender and age relationships, of the technological apparatus and the nature of production, and so on. Of course, there are many anarchists and other anti-political revolutionaries involved in this movement. The interventions took a variety of forms, of which I will mention just a few. There were the myriads of publications for spreading anarchist and anti-political analysis of the insurrection in course. A large number of pirate radio stations came into existence, helping enhance the spread of information about specific struggle within the area in which they were located in. In addition, many anarchists and others would come together in small affinity groups to carry out specific attacks and acts of sabotage relating to specific aspects of the ongoing struggle. Most of these groups were temporary with the aim of completing a specific action. One specific armed group, Azon Revolutionaria, AR, also grew out of an anti-political, anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist perspective. In reading these communiques and theoretical texts, it became clear that the group was largely influenced by Vanagem. For all practical purposes, it was an informal federation of affinity groups that carried out various armed attacks against the institutions of power. Unlike the Stalinist Red Brigades, which definitely intended to be the armed party leading the proletariat to victory, AR simply saw itself as a step towards the generalization of armed struggle. Nonetheless, it carried out its attacks in a fashion that allowed it to be spectacularized and separated from the larger struggle, thus on a practical level becoming specialists in one particular tool of struggle. The insurgent struggle of the 1970s in Italy advanced quite far. Certainly, many smelled revolution in the air, including, unfortunately, the authorities. It would be impossible to know to what extent this specific activity of anarchists or other anti-political revolutionaries actually influenced the direction of the general revolt, but certainly much of the intervention, from pirate radio to sabotage and beyond, was useful. And the ways in which many of the autonomous struggles, particularly small-scale actions, were organized are reminiscent of ideas and practices of the anarchists influenced by Ghelani's ideas. If groups like Azon Revolutionaria fell into the specific role, thus blunting the usefulness of their activity, many did not, and there was a capacity for serious critique in the midst of struggle, which allows us to learn from the events. Ultimately, severe state repression combined with the sowing of misunderstanding among those in revolt led to the dissipation of this movement. When the state hit, the movement was not prepared to defend itself. Although hints of the possibility of generalized armed struggle existed, individuals who were not a part of any specialized armed group were beginning to arm themselves for defense purposes. The combination of statements from certain left groups saying that the time was not right for armed conflict, combined with the media's spectacularization of specialized armed groups to prevent any clarity on this question. Nonetheless, a great deal of anarchist analysis of these times does exist, examining these questions of how insurgent struggles develop, of anarchist intervention, of armed struggle, and so on. And a great deal of experimentation and exploration along these lines continues in Italy to this day. Spain, 1976 to 1979. In December 1975, Franco, who had been a dictator of Spain for more than 35 years, died. As a new regime tried to reestablish order in the form of a democratic state, a wildcat movement broke out, opening possibilities for a new society in which states and bosses would have no place. The wildcat movement reflected several aspects of the times. The opening provided by the fall of the Franco regime, the reconstruction of Spanish capital desired by the ruling class at the expense of workers, the kowtowing of the unions and the various parties of the left to the demands of the ruling class in hope for legalization, the readiness of the exploited to grasp this opportunity to act in their own interests. The struggle spread through a large number of cities in Spain. Workers blockaded streets, went on flying pickets to spread news about the strikes elsewhere, set up barricades, battled police, and occupied factories and other spaces. The various actions of strikes were organized through daily factory assemblies where real decisions were made and biweekly joint assemblies which only had a coordinating function. In addition, as the movement spread, neighborhood assemblies also formed, spreading the struggle against exploitation through the terrain of daily life. Interestingly, it was the spread of the assembly movement beyond the factories that led to deeper critiques and the questioning of wage labor itself. The greatest weakness of this movement seems to be its tolerance for union and party hacks within the assemblies. These servants of the various oppositional bureaucrats were, of course, always calling for moderation and negotiation and attempting to gain control of the assemblies. Though they were usually ignored, they were not driven out of the assemblies, and in several incidents, they undermined struggles in course by usurpation and negotiation with the rulers. This played a major role in eventual dissipation of this revolt. Since Spain has such a strong anarchist history, anarchists undoubtedly played a significant role in this struggle, but not through any of the well-known organizations. The best-known anarchist organization in Spain, the CNT, proved again that it's first of all a labor union, that is to say, an organization that represents the struggles of workers in negotiation with the bosses. Like all other unions, it was seeking legalization in the new regime, and so played the same role as they did, one of trying to manipulate the struggles in the direction of the moderation and compromise. On the other hand, there were anti-political revolutionaries involved in the wildcat movement in various ways. During that time, anonymous writings were spread, analyzing the situation from an explicitly revolutionary perspective and exploiting the manipulations of the unions and parties. One group, calling themselves uncontrollables, using a derogatory term that everyone from Republicans to CNTistas used against those revolutionaries who would not obey the compromising leaders of the 1930s, offered ongoing analysis of the situation. In addition, there were the autonomous groups that were active later in the movement. These groups were made up of individuals from the exploited classes with a revolutionary analysis who decided to cease working and live outside the law, taking part in the struggle from this point. Their practice started from their own needs and desires, but since these included solidarity with others, their acts of expropriation, vandalism, and sabotage would reflect this complicity. They did not see themselves as any sort of specialists, but simply as individuals who had made a choice about how they wanted to live here and now in battle with this social order, and acted on that choice. Their interventions were precise and targeted so as to be understood in terms of the wildcat movement in course. Camiso, Sicily, 1982 to 83. In December 1979, the U.S. made an agreement with the Italian government to house cruise missiles in Italy. The agreement was made in secret, but in spring 1981, the news began to leak out. An airport near the town of Camiso in southern Sicily had been chosen as the base in which to house 112 nuclear missiles. Immediately, there was anger over this obvious intrusion into the lives of the people of the area. People began discussing the matter, and anarchists took part in these discussions, distributing leaflets and attending meetings about the base. The usual recuperators were on the scene right away, with the parties of the left forming peace committees aimed at the symbolic protest to influence the decisions of the rulers. But anarchists and other revolutionaries interested at the radical potential of the angry people of the region formed an organizing group aimed at an approach based on direct action and attack. While the peace committees organized massive symbolic demonstrations demanding peace, the anarchists and other revolutionaries of organizing group debated on how to develop concentrate the struggle in Kesmiso and other areas facing similar intrusions with specific objectives for struggle. Anarchists from Catania said the struggle should take place on a social and revolutionary basis using a methodology of attack aimed at striking the people and structures responsible for the decisions to install the base. In 1982, due to the irresolvable contradictions, the organizing group split. In April 1982, peace committees organized another peace march in Comiso. It was the usual pacifying bullshit, reflecting the opportunism of the leftist parties. So in May, the anarchists of Ragusa and Catania decided to intervene in order to bring together the massive opposition to the base, with the aim of occupying the base site. Throughout the next few months, they held a series of public meetings and distributed leaflets and other literature on the topic. Anarchist women went door to door in order to talk with the women of the region who rarely left their homes due to the extreme patriarchal nature of the regional culture. There was a positive response from the local population, so the anarchists proposed a method for organizing the struggle in an autonomous manner. Sicily has known insurgents in the past, and one of the common forms of self-organization was the self-managed league. Anarchists recommended that people consider adopting this form again for this struggle. An anarchist conference took place on July 31st, August 1st, ending with another open-air meeting in which the struggle against the missile base was connected with refusal of militarism, as one anarchist destroyed his conscription papers. Self-managed leagues began to develop, and anarchists set up a coordinating office for technical assistance and to facilitate communication between the leagues. Anarchists continued to hold public meetings and distribute leaflets. As leagues were forming among workers, students, unemployed, and so on, various actions, often aimed at taking the time and space necessary for discussing the matter, took place. In particular, high school students in Vitoria carried out strikes, using the time to discuss what to do. In the meantime, the effects of the base became clearer and clearer as local peasants were evicted from their land to make room for missile test ranges. As American and NATO officers reserved use of various hotels and other services, and as the mafia used intimidation and terror to try to frighten those who opposed the base, anarchists continued to contact workers, unemployed, students, and housewives in the area, but the forces of repression acted to obstruct their activity through intimidation, false information, and so on. The occupation itself never occurred. As the project went forward, a large number of anarchists came to Comiso, and most felt that the occupation was much too risky at the time. Nonetheless, the ongoing activity against the base during this time did lead to a number of explosive situations and certainly indicated the openness of many people in the area to self-organized struggle. The initiative ended with a huge demonstration that went to the missile base. The cops made several violent attacks against the demonstrators that lasted for several hours. The cops, in fact, pursued demonstrators for kilometers. The missile base went into operation in the mid-1980s, but was taken out of operation in 1992. What is interesting in this initiative is not its success or failure, but the attempt to encourage a self-organized revolt against the base, as opposed to the symbolic protest that the Italian Communist Party and other parties of the left were promoting. To this end, anarchists showed the connections between the missile base and the realities of exploitation in the area. The eviction of peasants from their land, the worsening economic situation for workers, the transience of the jobs promised during the period that the base is being built, etc. They also referred back to the past insurgents in the region, bringing up methods of self-organization that developed in this instance. Beyond this, they simply help to provide necessary tools. Did they escape the practice of politicking in the way they went about this? It seems to me that they did, but this is a matter for debate. Albania, 1997. In 1997, an uprising took place in Albania in which the apparatus of power was nearly dismantled. As is so often the case, the uprising was sparked by immediate banalities rather than grand ideologies. At the encouragement of Albanian President Salih Berisha, huge numbers of Albanian families had invested all their savings in a few finance companies that promised huge profits. These companies apparently operated some version of a pyramid scheme. In January, these companies went bankrupt one by one, depriving the already impoverished Albanian populace of what little they had. The Socialist Party called a demonstration in the capital, hoping to make themselves leaders of a peaceful protest movement. The rage expressed at the demonstration showed all the parties that this explosion was not controllable. Violent demonstrations spread further and further. Police stations, courts, and ministerial and party offices were attacked with stones. Town halls were set on fire. The vice premier was held hostage and beaten. Parliament was attacked and there was a prison revolt, all within the first couple of weeks. As the resistance spread, attacks against structures of the state and capital increased. People began arming themselves through attacks on policing stations, through raids on military armories, in which the conscripted soldiers were often complicit, and by various other means. Where at first demands were made, attacks became the usual practice. Government buildings, party headquarters, police headquarters, banks, and offices of the Secret Service all became fair game for attack. As the results spread, more and more people were armed. They were able to set up blockades to stop riot-controlled vehicles moving between various towns. They would disarm the police, thus arming themselves even further, strip them and burn their vehicles. Even Berisha's public residence was attacked and torched. Prisons, as well, were attacked and prisoners freed. The insurgents showed practicality in storming and taking weapons from police stations and freeing any prisoners in custody before burning them, as well as in always making police operations more and more difficult by stealing or destroying police equipment. Everyone, men, women, and children, armed themselves to fight the police and the military. Barricades and blockades were set up in the regions where the insurgents had control and anticipation of government counterattack. Police agents were sometimes captured or killed. Military personnel often deserted and joined the insurgents. As it became more obvious that the Albanian military would not be able to defeat the insurgents, due in part to desertions, the forces of recuperation came into play. The leaders of the opposition parties, defining themselves as representatives of the insurgents, declared conditions for surrender of arms by rebels, conditions that merely meant a change of government. None of this, of course, was done at the request of the insurgents. In the meantime, insurgents continued to attack government buildings, to loot shops, to arm themselves, and to build defenses. Much of the military deserted, either joining the insurgents or fleeing to Greece. The spread of revolt forced Berisha to attempt reconciliation with some opposition parties in an effort to recuperate the resistance. Public health committees consisting of members of opposition parties that wanted to control and tame the insurgents were formed in a number of insurgent towns. When they approved the agreement Berisha made the Socialist Party, insurgents ignored the PHC and made their own decisions. The insurgents were spreading rapidly, and countries bordering Albania began to fear that it would spread across borders. By mid-March, the government, including the secret police, was forced to flee the capital. Looting of arms and goods was rampant, and the Secret Service headquarters and the state bank were attacked. At this point, the EU promised humanitarian intervention with 50,000 troops, as well as technical advisors to help the Albanian authorities reestablish functioning police and military forces. By this time, the insurgents had reached the point where an Albanian minister claimed there are no functioning prisons. By the end of March, outside military intervention began. Between April and August, the combination of repression, recuperation, and military occupation restored public order. With the elections at the end of June, it could be said that the threat of revolution had disappeared due to the return of politics. And on August 12th, the multinational forces left Albania. Even after the fall of Hux's communist regime, Albania has not been the easiest place to get information from. So it's hard to know precisely how the insurgents organized their struggles. It appears that they did form assemblies. There were also insurgent councils, though, wherever they were, truly autonomous organizations of the exploited or organizations of recuperation by oppositional parties is not known. Since much of Albania is still fairly rural, it seems likely that old peasant structures offered some basis for creating horizontal decision-making structures. Because of the large extent of Italian economic interest in Albania, it played a major role in the international suppression of the revolt. At the same time, Italian anarchists sought to examine the situation and figure ways of expressing solidarity with Albanian insurgents. Unfortunately, the immediate repression they were facing due to the Marini investigation limited their possibilities, particularly as a number of these anarchists found themselves in prison.